Louisiana Public Broadcasting is proud to share some of the stories of the men and women of Louisiana during World War II. Louisiana's experience, World War II, chronicles the spirit, commitment, and sacrifice of our Louisiana heroes.
What finally spurred Louisiana's economy was the advent of World War II. The state became a crucial location for the United States military as the nation readied for battle.
0 hour in Louisiana, the greatest field exercise in American military history, with over 40,000 motorized vehicles and 500,000 men.
Louisiana was the site of many training camps and of the 1940 Louisiana Maneuvers, which were the biggest maneuvers ever held by the United States Army.
2,000 officer referees keep score as the Army puts the accent on tank warfare and anti-tank defense.
George Patton was a part of those maneuvers. Dwight Eisenhower made his reputation in the Louisiana Maneuvers.
There were 400,000 people involved in maneuvers. There were just an awful lot of soldiers in Louisiana, primarily in the central Louisiana. It ended the Depression for central Louisiana. The city of Pineville went from 26,000 in 1940 to 58,000 in 1950.
During the maneuvers in 1940 and 1941, mock battles were carried out over some 30,000 square miles of Louisiana soil. Before the end of the war, more than 1 million servicemen would receive their training at Fort Polk near Leesville.
Louisiana made its contribution and then some to the Second World War, both in food, of course, and cotton, and it was a place where German POWs captured in North Africa were sent and put to work, mainly in the cane fields, which the Germans hated.
Once the war began, Louisiana and her coastline actually became the scene of battle.
It was German submarines who came over in January and February, got across the Atlantic and got down into the Gulf of Mexico, and then right off the Louisiana coast began sinking oil tankers on their way up to the factories in the Northeast. So these submarines could come up at night, look through the periscope, and there would be a ship silhouetted against the sky by the lights on land. Boom! And they'd let them have it. The Germans called it the happy hunting ground.
On shore in New Orleans, thousands of workers were constructing a unique amphibious landing craft for a man named Andrew Higgins.
He was designing flat-bottom boats for the oil companies, which were then exploring in the bayous of Louisiana. And he built this boat that later became known as the Higgins Boat. A little more than 30 feet long with a flat bottom that could turn around in its own length. And he could put a ramp on it that could drop down so that a whole platoon of men, 30 men, could get off immediately and start firing right away. Every American soldier who went ashore in an invasion in World War II did so in a boat built in New Orleans at Higgins Industries. If Andy Higgins had not designed and then built those landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Adolf Hitler called Andy Higgins the new Noah.
Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, called him the man who won the war. Louisiana gave the nation inspiring war heroes. Some are well known, such as General Claire Chennault from Tensaw Parish, whose air squadron was the celebrated Flying Tigers. There were many others too, not so renowned to history, who helped win the war.
Louisiana also contributed more than its fair share of soldiers to the war effort. Men who joined up more volunteered out of Louisiana in proportion to the population than from any other state.
When I got to the beach, I found that the traffic control officer, who was a colonel, had become a casualty, and so I then was put in position as a 23-year-old Army captain. of being the traffic control officer for Omaha Beach.
Less than a year after the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, the war in Europe was won. Victory over Japan would soon follow.
No one forgets VJ Day. In New Orleans, the strippers came out of the bar on Bourbon Street. They came into the traffic on Canal and took all their clothes off. The whole country went crazy.
This is a lost city in the Louisiana forest. 14 miles north of Alexandria, it awaits for someone to pass through and ask, what is this amazing, deserted place? The ruins of barracks and mess halls peek through the piney woods between Tioga and Ball. The ruins of Camp Livingston are quite the sight. Before World War II, on 48,000 acres, the War Department set aside this rifle and artillery range. America might soon be drawn into the war in Europe and the Pacific, and America was not ready. So in March of 1941, the government took possession. Over 63,000 infantry soldiers trained here. 1,350 German prisoners were guarded here. Now, it is forgotten. More than any abandoned landmark in Louisiana, these deserted training camps haunt our fading memory of the Second World War.
Reese.
These days, the National Guard disciplines young people to straighten out their future at Camp Beauregard in Pineville. These teens signed up for a kind of boot camp. Over 60 years ago, a real close-order drill was practiced on this same earth.
Right.
The camp's Louisiana Maneuvers Museum honors a long local history of such discipline. Lieutenant Richard Moran is curator.
First, it was very hard, very Spartan conditions. You're talking about, at best, a squad-level tent, 8 men sleeping in a tent, and it was quite the improvement when you finally got a wooden floor to that, compared to some of the living I'm sure they had done as a civilian. The citizen soldiers, the National Guard, they were probably a little more used to that type of training because they had to do it on a more regular basis. But the Army had, or the country had instituted its first peacetime draft.
My brother Bill is in the Army now. We heard from him today. His waistline's getting back to normal now. Here's what he had to say.
Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 had American strategists worried. If we had to join the fight in Europe, how could we battle the Nazis' brutal and all-out assaults? We had to think fast and work out maneuvers to beat Hitler's blitzkrieg. Congress had just authorized expanding America's army to 210,000. The president wanted another 17,000. Everyone knew a huge number of our boys were untested, so the War Department authorized massive practice maneuvers. Louisiana would host those tests.
And in fact, the day that the 1940 maneuvers ended here in Louisiana, France had fallen. So by 1941, the Army had risen to such a strength, they said, okay, now it's time for an Army versus Army exercise. So they once again looked around and they said, Louisiana has the best location for it. So 472,000 men descended upon Louisiana. They were within a 50-mile radius of Camp Beauregard. Camp Beauregard was the headquarters for the maneuvers, and they commenced training.
By August 1940, Camp Beauregard headquartered more than 2 billion acres of complicated troop shuffles, mock battles, supply line tests, a shakedown that reached across the Sabine River into Texas. Some of the commanders are household names today.
General Eisenhower, at that point he was just a lieutenant colonel. You had Colonel Patton, later one-star General Patton.
When the men were furloughed from this dress rehearsal for war, they took in the sights of Alexandria.
You have the young ladies of Alexandria. And if you figure 27,000 people, if half of them were female, and then half again were of the dating age, well, so the ratio was fairly large, 200,000 to 6,000. I'd ask one of the ladies, I said, ma'am, how did the soldiers act while they were here? And she said, they were magnificent. And I said, ma'am, you'll forgive me, I find that hard to believe, soldiers being soldiers. They weren't a little crude or rough. She said, you don't understand. We were the only game in town. In fact, it helped to bring Louisiana out of the Great Depression. Camp Livingston alone had 14,000 people working on it to improve it and bring it up to Army standards.
We'll never see you pretty girls anymore.
Except for Camp Beauregard, there isn't much left to the hundreds of buildings sold off as war surplus by 1947. Concrete roads through pine trees are all to see today. Even before America entered the war, some of our men joined the Asian fight against invaders. Early in the Pacific conflict, their target was not Japan's bases and bombers. Some of the first American shots were fired by Louisianians in the skies over China.
Flying Tigers were an American volunteer group of Americans who volunteered to serve with General Chennault in China.
Waterproof native and U.S. Army General Claire Chennault was under contract to the Chinese government. He led a band of former American aviators who had resigned their commissions to fight in China as sort of soldiers of fortune. Baton Rouge's USS Kidd Museum exhibits artifacts from the Tigers. Maury Drummond is the curator.
The country was basically overrun by the Japanese prior to America's involvement or declaration of war against Japan. But they had a lot to do to stem, not so much to stem the tide, but to protect as many roads and bridges and escape routes and things like that for refugees and things of that nature.
The Flying Tigers were called Fei Wu in Chinese. They drew a line in the sky between invading Japanese and the grateful Chinese.
These men who flew these aircraft were so talented and so courageous. Because of their involvement, they saved millions of people's lives just because of the support that they gave Chiang Kai-shek.
One of the kids' prizes is a replica of a Flying Tiger. The original was piloted by a Louisiana son, Wilt Segura, also known as Flash. He named his plane after his fiancée, Joy. She and Flash settled in New Iberia after he came home from the war.
Well, he enjoyed every minute that he was over there. It was, a new experience to him. And it's a part of his life that he never forgot.
Joy says Flash didn't tell her about the risks he faced in the Chinese skies until it was all over. Still, she worried the whole time he was there.
He was shot down twice behind enemy lines, but walked back each time. One time they carried him over the mountains, maybe in a sedan chair because his legs were injured. And all of that was a very unusual experience.
Segura went to China in 1942 after America entered the war in the Pacific, and the Tigers became a regulation squadron of the Army Air Corps.
And of course then General Chennault was still there, and he was their overall commander-in-chief.
General Chennault and all the men who flew with the Flying Tigers were heroes in China. Many years later, some 20 some odd years ago, the Republic of Taiwan donated this statue you see behind us here to the state of Louisiana of General Chennault, a bronze statue of the general, for their appreciation for what the general did and all the men who flew for him.
The Flying Tigers' heroic missions had Louisiana boys fighting Japan, even before Pearl Harbor.
Oh, bell-bottom trousers, coat of navy blue. She loves her sailor, and he loves her too.
Then it began with the day FDR said would live in infamy. To understand it, our generation might liken the shock of Pearl Harbor to the September 11th attack on New York. That size, shock, and outrage. Louisiana boys were eyewitness fighters and victims. After Pearl Harbor, they joined up out of patriotism and for other reasons. After all, these were bad times all around.
If somebody went out and got a whole bunch of oysters, each one of them would get so many oysters, and they swap oysters for potatoes and so forth, and milk.
Willie Gros remembers what life was like in South Louisiana.
They'd swap milk for bread. It was mostly swap.
John Zanka's father ran a grocery, delivering bread to Point à la Hache.
My daddy used to sell bread for a nickel a loaf, and some people couldn't even afford that. They'd ask for the day-old bread, which he could sell to them for 3 cents a loaf.
Ed Jones was living in an orphanage.
Nobody had any jobs. My mother died, my dad left town, you know.
The desperation and depression led many Louisiana boys to join the Navy.
The Navy paid well. You got your clothes furnished. And 3 meals a day sounds very good, too.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will.
In September of 1940, America's Pacific Fleet was moved to Hawaii along with many Louisiana sailors. Ed Jones was on the California, first in a string of battleships tied together.
You could see when the planes came in, they were flying very low, and I could see the bombs leaving the plane, hitting the buildings, blowing them up. But we didn't know what was happening because we wasn't at war.
Willie Gros was also on Battleship Row, tied up next to the Oklahoma.
We watched the 2 bombs come out the bottom of the plane like that and hit, and the hangar just blew up. And Frisky said, "Oh my God, they're going to court-martial everybody on that island. Somebody forgot to take the warheads out the bombs."
John Zanka was across the harbor, a Louisiana eyewitness to the infamy.
I heard this bugle call that sounded rather strange. It was like one long note. And I thought to myself, now what the heck is he trying to play? And then I heard him hollering, the Japs are attacking.
I tell you what, I could actually see that pilot looking right at me like that. That's how close he was.
We only had a single hull. Picture yourself in a large steel drum and somebody on the outside with a massive hammer.
We could shoot at ships. We could shoot at shores. We couldn't shoot at an airplane.
Oklahoma was alongside of us. Well, the first time she was hit, she rocked back and forth like this. And then she started over and she wasn't coming back. And just as she got about 15 degrees, torpedoes hit her again. And she come back up. And she rocked and rolled for a while, and then she started over the 3rd time. And they hit her again, and she come back up again. But by this time, she went all the way over. But 7 torpedoes hit the Oklahoma.
When we took our first torpedo, it knocked out our electricity. And the ammunition hoist to send us up the ammunition wouldn't work. And the ventilators that get the fresh air to the men below wouldn't work. So everybody was down below was getting asphyxiated.
I saw what I imagined Dante envisioned when he said Inferno. There was smoke hanging all over the harbor. The battleships and other ships burning. You could see fire all over. There was fire in the water. We could see the boats running around trying to find people in the water and picking up survivors, still picking up survivors and still picking up dead bodies.
Sunday night was trying to get the men, the injured, the ones that were still in the water, the men coming out of the Oklahoma, and they was running everything from the Maryland to cutting into the bottom of the Oklahoma. There were so many men in there hitting on the steel that it sounded like a million bees. All you could hear was...
We were talking to them on phones.
If any of us have trouble imagining the horror, ask any of these Louisiana vets. How shocked was our generation after terrorist attacks on New York and Washington 60 years later? That's how shocked the nation was then. America woke up that day, and the men who survived fought on with fresh fortitude and a whole new commitment. In an instant, Louisiana business snapped to attention to support the war. Shipbuilders, welders, cooks, and oil workers. It felt like we were all in the fight. The Navy maintained huge steel and timber floating dry docks along the coast. 605 vessels were outfitted or repaired in South Louisiana, and another 5,000 ships serviced. Across the river from New Orleans, in Algiers, 20,000 men and women served the Navy. At the Pontchartrain lakefront, Andrew Higgins was a marine architect and industrialist working on shallow craft to help our boys take the beaches. He was learning from Louisianians who really knew boats, the Cajuns. By the time the Fifth Army landed in Italy and Douglas MacArthur landed in New Guinea, the American Navy had 14,000 vessels. 13,000 were designed and 9,000 built by a Louisiana firm called Higgins Industries down in New Orleans.
We built for D-Day for 2.5 years. The United States Army in 1940 had 160,000 men in it. It ranked 16th in the world, right behind Romania. 4 years later, it was an army of 8 million very well-equipped men. They went across in 6,000 ships of all types, including the Higgins Boats, none of which had existed in 1940. It was just miraculous what American industry did.
Above all, she's built to take punishment, to work without let-up for days on end in an operation that may be 1,000 miles away from a repair shop. At the start of the assembly line, frames are fitted into jigs, and the boat begins to take shape bottom side up.
If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built those landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. So he's the man who won the war for us.
In an old warehouse near the lakefront, a group of craftsmen worked to build a replica of a Higgins boat. Some of them built the real things in their day. Every weekend, the men talk about how Higgins and his inspired Louisiana workers turned the tide in the Second World War. Jerry Strahan was a history student of Stephen Ambrose. He's written a book about Louisiana shipbuilder Higgins and the people who made the boats that won the war.
In the 1930s, Andrew Jackson Higgins owned a small shipbuilding company in downtown New Orleans. They specialized in building boats for oil field companies and for trappers. They needed shallow draft boats that could navigate the bayous of Louisiana. It's because of these boats that he later built what is known as an LCVP. The early day workboat, the Eureka, evolved into the landing craft that totally changed the strategy of modern warfare. And that was designed and built here in the bayous of Louisiana. 92% of the entire U.S. Navy was designed and built in Louisiana.
Graham Haddock keeps a close eye on the mahogany replica. He can say if it's right because he was one of the original designers.
Well, let's say I'm the consultant on it. We're trying to build it as closely as we can to the last contract that Higgins had.
Andrew Higgins not only built boats, but trained men to use them properly. Richard McDerby headed the boat school.
So 2 months before Pearl Harbor, my first class, I'm senior instructor, in charge of school, but I'm the only instructor. And I trained at that time 25 Marines, first class. Carabel, Florida, they lost 23 men one night, drowned. So they called Mr. Higgins, and he got me over there immediately because a lot of these boys were getting ready to go overseas.
This was his philosophy. Let everybody do what the best they can, and as long as they doing that, let them do it.
As important as the Higgins boats were to war landings the world over, historians generally overlook this Louisiana man's contribution.
There are forgotten heroes on every beach, but in industry, he's the one person that, at the end of the war, that everyone tended to overlook. The Marine Corps thought that there would never come a day when Higgins would not be praised. That day has come. But people now are learning about him. Generations had forgotten about him for so long.
When they finally finished the last of their Higgins replica, these men donated the boat to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it can be appreciated today.
It's a way of saying thanks. The younger people who have shown up to work on this project have decided, in my opinion, that it's a way of saying thanks to an earlier generation that literally gave up their childhood and fought this war.
In Louisiana, many towns boast traces of a valiant home front effort in World War II. The state had 10 airfields from Barksdale up north down to Houma on the coast, where aircraft patrolled the Gulf for German submarines. We didn't hear much about it on the radio at the time. All news of military work was hushed to some degree. Stories are only surfacing now of all the training in our backyards. In Baton Rouge, Harding Field launched skilled pilots, some called barnstormers because they showed so much bravado.
Harding Field was born of necessity. Just before the outbreak of World War II, the government and the military here were poised, ready for action, because Hitler was running rampaging through Europe with his Nazis. The Japanese were running rampant through China and Asia, Burma. And so just to be prepared, they started building a military airport here. The main purpose primarily at first was just to safeguard the industrial corridor in this area. And then it evolved into a fighter-bomber training base. It grew.
Historian Billy Spadale has written Heroes of Harding Field, a book about one pilot training ground in Baton Rouge.
The headquarters was established in the old state capitol building downtown until the base was finished. So that was where it all began, and the building where the South seceded from the nation. They named it after a World War, after a Louisiana war hero who was William Wadley Harding, native of Shreveport, a young lieutenant that was killed on maneuvers just prior to Pearl Harbor.
One of the pilots who trained here is Quentin Aanenson.
You don't forget a day like D-Day. And that was my first combat mission. I hardly knew what was going on, except that as I looked down as we crossed the English Channel, and our point of target was over Point du Hoc, which is famous where the Rangers scaled the cliffs. Omaha Beach was right to our left. As I looked down and saw that massive channel filled with ships, and looked around me in the sky and saw planes all over, and all I was trying to do was hold my wing position, follow my leader, turn my gun switches on at the right time, arm my bombs, watch out that I didn't fly into anyone. You never forget that. It was scary, but it was a moment in history that I wouldn't have missed for anything, as long as it had to be.
Spadale remembers being 10 years old and watching pilots train over Baton Rouge. It was exciting, but too often tragic.
Which it was common back then, crashes. They crashed everywhere. One P-47 made a belly landing on the Baker High School football field right up the middle. They fell everywhere, in the river, across the river. Most of them were forced landings. Two B-17 four-engine bombers collided, and I saw that one. I watched them going through the death throes in the air with smoke trailing from this four-engine B-17. Saw the three parachutes in the air. Then I saw something coming down real slow. It looked like a falling leaf. Didn't know what it was, but I ran toward it with some of my buddies. We crossed fences and lawns and yards. Got to it. It was the tail section, complete tail section of a B-17 bomber. Huge. It blew my mind. It was so big. And it landed, luckily, right behind the house. It almost hit the house, right behind the back porch of a house on Plank Road.
With the skills he learned at Harding Field and some luck, Quentin Aanenson made it through the war in Europe.
I wrote a farewell letter. This was in late June of 1944, and I had only been in combat for about 6 weeks, but it was apparent that already the law of averages was coming up on me. I wrote it after one of my close friends bailed out after he had been hit by flak. He bailed out on our side of the lines, and his parachute didn't open, and we watched him fall 8,000 feet. So when I got back to my tent that night, I sat down and wrote 2 farewell letters. I left instructions with my friends that if I were killed, these letters were to be mailed. We all did that. The sad thing about it is that I had 3 different people set up to mail my farewell letters if and when I was killed. I ended up mailing all of theirs. All 3 of them were killed. So finally I just left almost to whom it may concern. If I'm killed,
In 1942, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Annelle Henderson Bulechek of Lake Charles learned of a new organization, the Women's Airforce Service Pilots. A group started to help ease the pilot shortage during the early years of the war. She applied and was accepted. She flew over the Gulf of Mexico searching for enemy submarines, towed aerial gunnery targets, and survived a crash after losing an engine near Sweetwater, Texas. In her own words, this is her story.
Back in the 30s, I started flying or taking flying lessons when I could afford it because it was expensive in those days. It was anywhere from $2 to $3 a lesson, and that was a lot of money back in the 30s. Anyway, I did manage to get in my flying lessons, and I got my private pilot's license. Right at the beginning of World War II, I helped form the Civil Air Patrol here. And we flew missions out into the Gulf and actually spotted several submarines and Germans coming ashore right after the beginning of the war. And that was quite a group, too. And then I heard about the WASPs, and they were accepting women for Air Corps training. It was the Army Air Corps in those days. It was not the Air Force. Well, 25,000 women applied, and 1,830 were accepted, and 1,074 of us made it through the training, which was about the washout rate that the men had. We had 210 hours of flying instruction, the same primary, basic, and advanced, same training the men had, and we were issued GI coveralls, and the only way we could get them cleaned was to go in there with lava soap and scrub brush, and we'd scrub each other down in these size 40, the only size they had were size 40, coveralls, and we'd roll the sleeves up, and we had bat wings, and we'd roll the pants up, and we had the crotch here, and looked like a little skirt, and then we'd tighten the waist just tight as we could get them, and that was our flying gear. Of course, I wrote back and forth to my Aunt Mabel and my Aunt Annabelle, who was Mrs. T.A.D's, and my friends. I had a lot of letters from my friends. And I wrote about all my crazy experiences, and but they're all gone. Those letters are gone. But they're not gone as long as I can remember them, and I've told my child and my grandchildren about it. And as long as you will remember it, those are my letters, or my memories that I want to share with you. 35 girls were killed in service of our 1,074 that made it through. The last class did not get an assignment. Actually, only 900 and some odd of us saw service. And 35 girls were killed in service. And if you were killed as a WASP, your parents sent for the body, or the girls took up a collection and sent the body home because the government wouldn't, or couldn't, or didn't. We had the world's largest peacetime maneuvers here in southwest Louisiana. All of the Army was down here training before the war. This is before Pearl Harbor. And all the newsmen came down here. And Miss Emma Mickey was entertaining all of the newsmen at her house. And Colonel Eisenhower was there. He was part of all of this. Of course, he was running the thing. And we were at a party at Miss Emma's, which was an outdoor party with red checkered tablecloths and all the finger foods, the fried chicken and everything. And I was sitting next to Drew Pearson, who had the Washington Merry-Go-Round column, which ran in all the newspapers. And we were visiting and talking and so forth. And he turned to me and he says, "Pardon me, young ladies, but where is the silverware?" And I don't know what made me think of it or say it, but I said, "Mr. Pearson, what silverware you damn Yankees didn't steal during that other war, we're hiding during this one." And he started laughing. And then about a week later, it came out in the Washington Merry-Go-Round. Jean Haskell put it best when she said, "It was just like they'd left the Porsche in the driveway with the keys in it, and we took it for the ride of our lives."
"5,000 feet of dark salt water is a cold tomb. Even with the best array of sensors and computer enhancements, this ghost is barely visible. There, just a grainy shadow of what once was an evil menace. It's appropriate that after over 50 years, we still have only a peek. Its victims may not have gotten even that. A German Untersee boat, the high-tech stealth fighter of the Second World War.
I think my first reaction was disbelief, because I saw it, and it was supposed to have been another wreck it had previously been identified as a freighter, a very large freighter, about a 7,000-ton freighter. And when I first saw the image, I'm like, kind of like, that doesn't look right.
The chance of us actually finding it was a long shot.
Robert Church and Dan Warren are marine archaeologists with C&C Technologies. The Lafayette Company is a world leader in underwater mapping for oil companies. Shell and British Petroleum wanted to know if the bottom of the Gulf near the mouth of the Mississippi was clear for a pipeline. C&C sent down this probe, their best remote scanner.
Actually, Dan and I were kidding each other that evening that we did see these images on the sonar first. I had to leave early, and Dan was going to look through the data, and he was kidding around with me saying, I'm gonna see this U-boat when you walk out of here, give you a call tonight, and you're going to have to come running back up here to the office. And that's almost exactly what happened, except he did call me, but I didn't believe him. And then the next morning when I came into work, I had an image sitting there that, anyone else could have looked at that image and said, okay, it's a sonar contact. But it had the right shape for a U-boat.
I'm looking actually for the report of the German captain
For over 40 years, C.J. Christ of Houma has amassed a huge personal collection of microfilm, Nazi naval records, commercial shipping logs, nearly all there is to know about America's other war in the Gulf, the one Hitler launched from France.
You can see U-166 was a large submarine, 252 feet long, 22 feet wide, and they were submerged along the route of the Robert E. Lee.
The Robert E. Lee was a commercial freighter pressed into American war service. It was carrying 268 passengers from Trinidad to New Orleans when its military escort may have made a grave mistake.
Ever since the day before, when the Robert E. Lee tried to get into Tampa, the Robert E. Lee has been using their radio, and so has their escort been using their radio, asking for a pilot to get into the harbor, then being refused a pilot or none available, and then the Robert E. Lee called their escort and said, "Will you now escort me to New Orleans?" And the escort answers back, "Well, I'll have to call headquarters and get permission." So then they call headquarters. Headquarters calls back and says, "You have permission." So the PC-566, the escort, says, "Follow me to New Orleans." And Robert E. Lee says, "Okay, we'll follow you to New Orleans." You know, all of this going on the 500-meter or 600-meter band that all the U-boats listen to.
In a flash, U-166 made its run and pulled the trigger.
And so when he sighted the Robert E. Lee, I'm sure he started into the attack position, and when his range and bearing and torpedo depth and so forth was right in his estimation, he said, "Los," and he fired a torpedo.
The captain of the Robert E. Lee's military escort was eventually reprimanded. It wasn't known at the time that he is the one who did in U-166.
He realizes that the submarine, the captain, is not looking at him or looking around for anything. He is watching the Robert E. Lee sink. So he goes around and comes up on the submarine, and he puts out 5 depth charges, 2 of which are fired from the deck, the foredeck, and 3 of which are rolled off the stern.
The pattern of wreckage of the German boat on the sea floor indicates it was killed by a depth charge that very day.
And by this time, 407 people are in the water. And he opts to start picking up survivors rather than make another run.
And we started across the seafloor, and it took a little while. And the very first thing we come to was all of a sudden this wall of iron. And we didn't know initially what we were looking at until the ROV pilot started panning up. And then we realized what we're looking at is the side of the conning tower. And you can just see the lip of the conning tower. Now we've moved around to the front of the conning tower, and you can see all that splash guard and everything is in great shape. Right there in the center, that's where the periscope would come up. Here's the aft portion of the conning tower. This is the railing that goes around what they call the Venter Garden, which is, and there's the 20mm anti-aircraft gun there on that Venter Garden. Now there is a lot of suspension in the water, as you can see, and a lot of plankton. So it wasn't probably the best for filming, but it was good enough for what we needed to do, and that was to go down and confirm that this was a 9C German U-boat in U-166.
In 1942, 17 German U-boats sank 56 ships in the Gulf of Mexico. Ivy Labatut of New Roads is hosting a reunion of longtime friends. Most of his comrades are in their 80s. They go back a good bit, back to when Sergeant Labatut was 19 years old.
Frank Wisconsin from Winter Bridge, Bronx, New York. Lieutenant Northfield from Schenectady, New York. Now all them Yankees, and they had me as a driver from New Roads, Louisiana, right here.
On Veterans Day 2001, the soldiers of the 760th Tank Battalion came from all over the country. But Sergeant Robert Richard only had to drive from Shreveport. In 1941, he signed up in plain dealing.
I decided to join the Army. So at first my mother wasn't going to let me, and I told her, I said, either I join the Army and you know where I'm at, or I'm going to go and join and you won't know where I'm at. So she decided she wanted to know where I was at.
The 760th. They joined from plane dealing and Muskegon, Michigan, the home of tank driver George Carron.
When I heard Pearl Harbor, I was damn mad. I went right down to sign up.
The Army trained many of them together, first at Camp Bowie, Texas, and then at Fort Benning, Georgia. They thought they might be sent to England, but when some pamphlets teaching Arabic phrases arrived, they all knew they were heading to North Africa.
We were solely there to keep as many German troops as possible down there so that they could make the big invasion of France. And if that was so, we did that.
Besides mauling and invading most of Europe, Germany had helped Italy conquer oil fields and shipping routes across the Middle East. The boys of the 760th, like tens of thousands of ours, crossed the Atlantic in crowded troop carriers, wary of U-boat attacks, but in high spirits.
And they'd been hauling prisoners on that thing. And they had one fellow with us from Tennessee there. He was hairy as a gorilla. Running pool from Tennessee. When he shaved, he had to separate it from down here. Just draw a line, separate it.
Arab ports were quickly confiscated, and American supplies and arms began pouring in. The 760th faced the Germans' best tank, the Mark VI Tiger, with an 88mm gun. It was 1942. Sergeant and Tank Commander Ray Hutchins.
The hand-to-hand fighting of the infantry was the most unusual experience that I'd seen. We actually got involved in that, you know. They was did hand-to-hand fighting, and that's rough.
Sergeant and Tank Commander Harry Schroder of Wisconsin, and tank driver Carl Tetter of Georgia.
By the door, there was an old lady standing there, about 80 years old. There was a little girl there, about 6 years old. I was standing in front of him, and he let that shell go, and I don't know to this day where that shell hit. That woman and both of them, two women, the old lady and the kid were both dead. It pulled me off the ground, but I don't know how far, but I left the sidewalk. I went up. They caught me in the leg, and the scare was so great, I underneath the tank. And I laid there, and I looked out. When the dust cleared away, there was Italians laying all over the circle.
I couldn't get by them. I had to sit there, and they zeroed in on me. That German 88mm, that's what got me. It took 45 pieces of shrapnel out of me at one time. That finger shot through the nose, all the way through, up and down this side and this arm. 45 pieces of shrapnel at one time. That's the worst thing. I went to the hospital right after that. They kept me in the hospital 30 days and sent me back.
Through blinding sand, temperatures inside the tanks of 140 degrees, through setbacks and every day picking up straggling and surrendering Germans and Italian soldiers, they pushed through North Africa. Then across the Mediterranean and up through Italy, across pontoon bridges, through landmines, the gruesome battle for Cassino, and after unimaginable struggle and unbearable loss, on to Rome.
We were just a GHQ tank battalion that could be put in the line anywhere to beef up the lines where they expected an attack or anything like that. That was our purpose.
The 760th Tank Battalion had been on duty for 4 years and 3 months. 2 years, 9 months they served overseas. It was not all dire struggle, though. The men had their laughs, too. They still tell of the missing can of fruit cocktail.
I don't care what he tells you. I didn't have nothing to do with it. He told us the fruit cocktail story. He said he ate some of it.
To this day, no one has fessed up to stealing the fruit cocktail. When the job was done, they came home to plane dealing and new roads, but they never forgot their friends. In the early 1960s, they began a tradition. These reunions are held at the homes of their comrades nearly every year. Home movies prove the camaraderie they've always enjoyed, but the reunions have become more infrequent. Each year, there are fewer friends to visit.
You know, we have a feeling of closeness and When we walk by those that are here, we remember those that are not. And we're always sitting with memories lingering in our minds. People ask us, you know, well, what was war like and all of these things? Well, it's one of those things you can't describe. It's one of those things that you remember incidents now and again, but incidents you don't really want to comment on.
Theirs is one more Louisiana story we can count among this, a meager sampling of war tales. Thousands of stories of thousands of men and women who risked their lives to save millions can be found anywhere in Louisiana. These few tales offer good reason we're proud of our Louisiana home front and our Louisiana hero.
Ken Burns, your new series, Fall 2007, follows some extraordinary series, Civil War, baseball, jazz. Where does this series fit into our understanding of who we are as Americans?
Well, I think the Civil War is still the most important event that happened to Americans, but you could make a really good argument that the most important thing that happened in the history of the world is the Second World War. It's the greatest cataclysm in human history as we describe it. And though for years we'd painfully tried to avoid dealing with the Second World War, we, in the end, couldn't help being drawn into it. And then you have this body of human beings who are beginning to pass from the scene, who we need to bear witness to their memories and their stories, and they are incredible stories. And so we've designed a film that fits, I think, very much into the tradition of the Civil War in baseball and jazz, but is in some ways wholly different. It's entirely a bottom-up story in which there are no sort of famous names, no experts, no Shelby Footes from the luxury of an armchair telling you what happened, but people who were actually there. And if you weren't there, alive at that time, worrying about somebody in a prison camp or actually doing fighting, you're not in our film. And more to the point, we've further limited. Most of the people that we deal with are from 4 geographically distributed and therefore representative American towns: Waterbury, Connecticut, Mobile, Alabama, Sacramento, California, and a tiny farming community called Laverne, Minnesota. And so most of the stories revolve around individuals from those towns. They're African-American stories, they're Japanese-American stories, they're Jewish and Southern and Central European immigrant stories, they're regular American stories, they're farmers, they're businessmen, they're aspiring doctors. It's across the board. It's basically what we like to say is it's somebody you could have had Thanksgiving with. And the final theme of the film is that there are no ordinary lives. We've taken so-called ordinary people and I hope reminded everybody that it takes only a small amount of effort to sort of penetrate the surface appearance of things before you come to extraordinary complexity. In the case of these young men, amazing courage and heroism.
Well, it seems that today we are a culture in which we celebrate people who are, quote, celebrities, rather than the heroic efforts of ordinary people.
I think that's exactly right. We are sort of suffering from a new kind of tyranny. We've replaced the royalty that we supposedly got rid of 200 plus years ago with a new kind of royalty, the people with bold-faced names, who, it seems to me, do the exact same things that we do. They fall in love, they get divorced, they have children, but for some reason or another, when they do it, it seems so important that you can stampede other people. And what happens is that we begin to diminish our own experiences, and we begin to not value what a well-rounded life is about. We tend to want to be like them. We focus on what they do, and it's to our detriment as a country. And what happens in that celebrity culture is we become focused on buying things and looking like them and becoming abnormally thin or or all the other afflictions that attend to this world, and we forget our own past.
It is remarkable that young people today, my appreciation is 40% of them think perhaps that America was allied with Germany against Japan, that there's no real understanding of history.
It used to be that when you made a documentary about the Second World War, it was Victory at Sea or World at War. You covered the entire spectrum of stuff that was going on. Today we provide no context. We have really wonderful moments, particularly Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, where we drop some people into particular scenes, and the verisimilitude is so magnificent that we're there, but we also tend to forget why they were there, or what was the cause of their fighting, what was the consequence of certain actions, why they're there at that particular time. A myriad questions that don't need homework, that don't need castor oil to learn, but just need a kind of a broader and yet we thought even more specific attention, and that's what we tried to do. And it's interesting that by focusing entirely on the bottom up in our story, paradoxically you get the larger aerial view of the war, I think, a lot better. And one of the reasons is that you've got a dog in that fight. You care about this landing, and you want to know why it happened and where it is and what that Japanese island was or what the South Pacific island was, because you care about somebody who's landing there. He's not just somebody's mother's son, but he's somebody you've gotten to know. You know his aspirations. You know his sister back home, and that means something.
Well, thank you, and we're certainly looking forward to the series in the fall.
Yeah, it will be the biggest footprint I think PBS will ever make, so it'll be hard to miss the broadcast, and I can't wait to share it with you.